My name is Julian Crane, and last Thursday my wife, Marissa Crane, CEO of Orion Systems, fired me. I remember how the fluorescent lights in the boardroom reflected off the glass conference table, splitting the room into harsh rectangles of glare and shadow. I had arrived early, as always, carrying my laptop bag slung over one shoulder and juggling a coffee in my hand. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panorama of downtown Manhattan's hustle, jutting steel and glass facades stretching endlessly toward the horizon. I thought about greeting her with a kiss, about walking side by side to the corner cafe afterward, but as soon as I stepped into the conference room, I sensed that whatever ritual remained between us had been replaced by something colder and more transactional. I had been Director of Global Language Services for 5 years, a title that sounded grander than the reality of my day-to-day tasks. Coordinating between localization vendors, meeting with regional marketing heads, rewriting Japanese press releases so that clients in Shanghai didn't mistake seasonal sale for regional bail. I was the human hinge connecting Orion Systems to the rest of the world. Essentially the only thing preventing our international partnerships from collapsing into awkward misunderstandings and lost millions. I had flown to Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Nairobi, and Delhi multiple times, spending hours in windowless meeting rooms, sipping too-strong hotel coffee, and listening to senior executives recite buzzwords about market penetration and digital synergy. But when I arrived in that boardroom on Thursday morning, none of that experience mattered. Not to Marissa. She sat at the head of the table, the woman who had once been the reason I learned to love foreign poetry. She had retreated into algorithms and growth metrics, leaving the art of language translation in the dust. Her chair was tilted back slightly, long legs crossed at the ankle, and she had a half-smile that suggested amusement rather than affection. She tapped her manicured nail against the polished wood as if she were drumming out a rhythm only she could hear. The tension settled in my chest like lead as I took my seat across from her. Around us, the empty chairs bore silent testimony to the fact that no one else was present. It was just us, husband and wife, CEO and director, power couple in a crumbling marriage. "I assume you read the memo I sent this morning," Marissa began, voice cool and clipped. I had skimmed it on my way in. Effective immediately, Global Language Services Division to be dissolved. All responsibilities reassigned to Digital Integration Team. Thank you for your contributions. It felt like a guillotine delivered by email. I closed the memo, set it on the table in front of her, and cleared my throat. I did. I have some questions. My pulse ticked up. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that always accompanied conflict, but this time it was laced with something darker: betrayal. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands clasped. "Julian, we're not here to debate the decision. I'm simply letting you know that, as of today, your role no longer exists. We've found a more scalable, AI-driven solution for translation. Even Google Translate can do this." Her precise words echoed in my mind longer than I expected. She had dropped the phrase, "Even Google Translate can do this," as if it were a casual aside, no different from commenting on the weather. But it felt like a knife to something fundamental. My purpose, my identity, the countless hours I'd spent perfecting each translation nuance so that contracts didn't offend cultural sensibilities and marketing materials didn't blunder into embarrassing mistranslations. I thought of the mornings I woke before dawn to send final drafts to our teams in Berlin and Buenos Aires. I recalled the late nights rewriting product launch videos in Arabic so that Arabic-speaking customers in Cairo felt included and respected. I remembered sitting in a cramped Tokyo cafe while an Ishikawa Holdings executive told me, in Japanese, that Julian Crane understands us better than any machine. Those were moments when I felt indispensable. Now, my wife dismissed all of that with a single sentence. Because I refused to be the one to break the silence first, the boardroom remained still. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound as I leaned back in my chair, placing the rim of my coffee mug against my lips to hide the tremor in my jaw. My hands, folded neatly on the table, itched to clutch something: an office phone, a pen, the edge of the tabletop, anything to anchor me. I stared at her, searching her face for a flicker of remorse or hesitation. Instead, I saw nothing but certainty, a conviction that I had become expendable. I wondered when she had started plotting this, whether it had been weeks or months ago, how many late-night strategy sessions had passed without me. In that moment, our marriage felt like a ledger, and I was the line item being cut. She waved a hand at the memo. I'm sorry it had to come to this, Julian, but there's no room for emotions in business decisions. You understand that." Her voice was softer, but her eyes remained ice-cold. I thought back to when she would gently correct my pronunciation of French phrases, when she whispered my name during poetic recitals of Baudelaire. That Julian Crane, the husband who translated love letters to English for her when she studied abroad, felt impossibly distant now. How had we fallen so far that she could callously dismantle the division I had built from scratch? I placed my coffee mug on the table and exhaled, allowing a calmness I didn't entirely feel to settle over me. "If you believe Google Translate can achieve what I've spent years perfecting, then be my guest," I said quietly, refusing to let my voice crack. I thought I sounded composed, but inside I felt my entire world constricting. She shifted in her seat, her lips twitching, a flicker of impatience. "Julian, this isn't a negotiation. It's a statement of fact. The department is done. Your job is done. You're free to collect any severance you're entitled to and exit the company at your earliest convenience." Her words felt like a judge's gavel. I imagined the moment replaying on some mental stage. Julian Crane, let go for obsolescence. She seemed to relish it, as if firing her own husband had been a feat of corporate prowess instead of a moment that should have shattered both our personal and professional lives. I straightened my shoulders and stood, picking up my laptop bag with deliberate slowness, as though to prove I was unaffected. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "I wish you luck at your next meeting." I let the words hang between us, savoring the way her faint expression of confusion revealed that she thought I meant something polite. But I didn't. Inside, I was already plotting my next move. As I turned away, my shoes clicked on the marble floor. Each step echoed like a metronome counting down the end of our partnership. She remained seated, unmoving, as though I would vanish and reappear once she had updated the organizational chart. I passed the bronze plaques of Orion Systems' wall of innovators in the hallway, names of engineers and strategists, some still employed, others long gone. When I reached the elevator bank, I waited for the doors to open, feeling a wave of vertigo at the finality of it all. I knew, as the elevator descended, that I was stepping out of one life and into another unknown chapter. By the time I reached the lobby, I kept my expression neutral. The receptionist glanced up, offering her customary nod as if I still belonged there. She had no idea I had been fired moments before. News traveled slowly when it involved personal relationships. I pulled my phone from my pocket and saw an email from Ishikawa Holdings blinking in my inbox. A message thanking me for past meetings and offering to loop me into next week's negotiation. A small, triumphant smile curved my lips, but I folded it away before anyone could see. I walked out onto the sidewalk, inhaling the crisp autumn air, feeling the weight of everything I had lost, and yet strangely liberated by the sense of possibility that came with being let go. I hailed a cab and slipped inside, watching the city blur by through tinted windows. Traffic slowed to a crawl, and I thought about the clients I'd personally flown across the world to meet, clients who had sent handwritten thank you notes saying, "You are the reason we trust your company." Now, without me, Marissa thought those relationships could be casually rerouted through algorithms and software. She didn't know that Ishikawa Holdings already had messages queued for her inbox. "We do not speak to machines." I felt a surge of grim satisfaction knowing that her dismissal would come with consequences she hadn't anticipated. But I didn't dwell on that too long. I was beyond caring about collateral damage. Today was about me, reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped away on polished conference room marble. As the cab pulled up at my apartment building, I paid the driver, then climbed out into the chill. I carried my laptop bag over one shoulder and my coffee mug in my hand, cold now but still heavy. I walked to my front door, paused, and looked up at the high-rises lining the street. For the first time in years, I didn't feel buried by expectations or overshadowed by my wife's ambition. I felt alive with purpose, to prove that translation was far more complex than a machine could grasp, and to show her that I was not so easily replaced. I entered the lobby and rode the elevator to the 10th floor. The moment I stepped into my apartment, I closed the door behind me, exhaling a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. In the stillness, I let my mind wander through the next logical step, crafting a plan for how to demonstrate to Orion and to Marissa that they had made a grave mistake. But first, I needed to clear my head. I walked to the window overlooking the city, set the coffee mug on the windowsill, and closed my eyes. The world outside continued its relentless pulse. New York moved on, as though unaware that one man's life had been upended. Marissa had believed that firing me would prove it was just business. But I had something she lacked, the unwavering conviction that language is more than text on a page. It is nuance, empathy, connection. I would remind her of that. And when the day came that she realized Google Translate couldn't capture the subtleties of a Japanese to English contract, when she saw the tears of frustration in Ishikawa's delegation as they struggled with machine speak, she would remember Julian Crane. She would remember that the human voice matters in ways no algorithm could replicate. They thought I meant it politely. I didn't. I meant every word. And already, a new storm was gathering on the horizon. When I intended to weather with my head held high, unbound by the title she had stripped from me. 2 weeks before I was fired, a new hire walked into the boardroom like she owned the place, Callista Byrne. She was loud, confident, and disruptive, the kind of woman who used her voice as a weapon, slicing through conversations like a razor. I'd seen her type before, fresh from some digital strategy agency, armed with analytics and an ego large enough to power an entire marketing department. She carried a tablet everywhere, eyes glued to the screen as if it contained the secrets of the universe. But she didn't have the patience, or maybe the humility, to understand the complexities that I had spent years mastering. Translation wasn't just words on a page, it was understanding the nuances, the culture, the unspoken meanings that could make or break a multi-million-dollar deal. Callista didn't care about any of that. To her, translation was just another line on a balance sheet that could be streamlined, optimized, automated. Marissa, my wife, the CEO, brought her in. The moment she introduced Callista at the Monday morning leadership meeting, I felt a flicker of something I didn't want to acknowledge: betrayal. She told me, over drinks one night, that she wanted to modernize the company's digital footprint, but she never said she was bringing in a hatchet woman to cut away everything that made my work matter. I watched Callista from across the polished conference table as she gave her credentials, top of her class, digital strategist for some high-profile SEO firm, handpicked by Marissa herself. Her lipstick was a sharp, perfect red, the kind that made you wonder if she'd marked the mirror with a smile before walking into the room. She had the look of someone who thrived on disruption, who enjoyed the messy aftermath of broken systems and bruised egos. I tried to be gracious at first. I offered to walk her through our global partnerships, to explain why translation wasn't just about language, but about trust and relationships. She brushed me off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Julian's good," she told the team, "but come on, it's just translation, right?" The words struck me harder than I wanted to admit. I caught Marissa's eyes, hoping for a sign that she'd defend me, that she'd remind Callista of the time I personally flew to Tokyo to salvage a contract that would have crumbled without my intervention. Instead, Marissa laughed. She actually laughed, like it was a joke we were all in on. My chest tightened. That was when I knew the betrayal had already begun. From that day forward, Callista made it her mission to undermine everything I did. Every time I presented a new localization plan, she countered with AI tools and software that she claimed could do the job faster, cheaper, better. She threw around words like scalability and automation, and every time she spoke, I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. She'd slide her tablet across the table, her manicured finger tapping on some pie chart that supposedly proved my department was obsolete. And every time she did it, Marissa leaned in a little closer, nodding, her expression that of a woman who saw dollar signs instead of the faces of the partners I'd built trust with over the years. The worst part was the subtlety of it. Callista never came at me head-on. She knew better than to challenge me outright. Instead, she asked questions designed to plant doubt. "Julian, have you considered that AI might actually be more accurate than a human in some cases?" Or, "Julian, wouldn't it be easier if we didn't have to rely on one person to handle all our translation needs?" She'd toss those out in meetings, eyes wide with feigned innocence, while Marissa watched with that same cold amusement. Each question chipped away at my credibility, and I could see the rest of the leadership team shifting uncomfortably, glancing at each other like maybe Callista had a point. One afternoon, I stayed late to review a contract from Ishikawa Holdings, a Japanese conglomerate that had been one of our most important partners. The text was filled with delicate nuances, honorifics, idioms, cultural references that no machine would ever catch. As I carefully crafted the English version, I saw Callista in the doorway, leaning against the frame, her red lips curved in a smirk. "Working late?" she asked, the words laced with condescension. I didn't bother to answer. She sauntered over, dropping her tablet on the table. "You know," she said, flipping the screen toward me. "There's an AI tool that can handle that entire contract in minutes." I looked at her, my jaw tight. "And it would butcher every nuance," I replied evenly. She just laughed, a sound that grated on my nerves. "Julian, we live in a world of automation. You need to get with the program." Then she turned and left, the echo of her heels like gunshots in the empty corridor. After she left, I sat there staring at the contract, the Japanese characters dancing on the screen. I thought about the clients who trusted me to get it right, to make sure their voices were heard in the global conversation. I thought about the times I'd stayed up all night to make sure every detail was perfect, because to me, translation was personal. It was about people, not just words. And yet, here I was, being systematically erased by a woman who thought an algorithm could do my job better. My chest burned with anger, but I kept my face calm, my hands steady on the keyboard. I wasn't going to give Callista the satisfaction of seeing me rattle. The days blurred together after that. Every meeting felt like a battle, every conversation a minefield. Callista was always there, her red lipstick a constant reminder of the war I was fighting. Marissa, my wife, my partner, became a stranger in those meetings, siding with Callista more often than not. I'd watch her face as she listened to Callista's pitches about digital synergy and AI integration, and I wondered if she even remembered why she hired me in the first place. I wondered if she remembered the late nights we'd spent working side by side, me with my translations, her with her strategy decks, both of us dreaming of building something meaningful. I wondered when she stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as a liability. One night, as I left the office, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the elevator doors. I looked older, more tired than I had in years. My hair had a few more streaks of gray, my eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. I thought about the conversations I'd had with Marissa before we were married, about how she'd told me she loved my passion for languages, how she'd said it made her feel like the world was a little smaller, a little more connected. I thought about how that passion had built my entire career, and how now it was being dismantled by a woman with a tablet and a smile. I pressed the elevator button, my finger trembling just slightly. As the doors opened, I stepped inside and let the doors close behind me. The hum of the elevator was the only sound, a low mechanical whisper that felt strangely comforting. I leaned against the cool metal, eyes closed, and promised myself I wouldn't let them erase me. I wouldn't let Callista's arrogance and Marissa's betrayal define my worth. I was more than a line on a spreadsheet. I was the bridge between cultures, the voice that made sure every partnership felt like a handshake instead of a transaction. And no machine, no matter how sophisticated, could ever replicate that. As the elevator descended, I opened my eyes and stared at my reflection once more. I saw the determination in my own gaze, the spark that no amount of AI could extinguish. Callista might have thought she was setting a trap for me, but she didn't know that I had already started planning my way out. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. And when the time came, I would make sure they understood that translation was more than words. It was trust. It was respect. It was human. And I was ready to prove it. The moment arrived on a Friday, a day that usually carried the promise of a weekend reprieve from the corporate battlefield. I should have known better than to trust Fridays. The leadership meeting was already humming when I walked in, a tension in the air so thick it felt like walking into a sauna of whispered doubts and silent betrayals. Marissa, my wife, at least in name, if not in spirit, sat at the head of the table with the poise of a queen in a boardroom castle. Her hair was perfectly styled, her blouse crisply pressed, and her smile held a steel edge I'd come to recognize over the past few weeks. She wore it like a mask, and I wondered if she'd even removed it when she brushed her teeth that morning. I took my seat at the far end of the polished walnut table, my laptop open in front of me, the carefully crafted slides for Ishikawa Holdings ready to present. Ishikawa was our largest Japanese client, and their demands for precision and respect in communication were legendary. I had spent countless late nights fine-tuning our multi-phase localization strategy, ensuring that every phrase in the contract aligned perfectly with their cultural expectations. One slip, one misunderstanding, and we'd risk not just the contract but the entire relationship. I glanced around at the leadership team, most of whom wore polite interest or mild boredom like badges of honor. Gregory Cho, the general counsel, gave me a tight nod. Tarek, the junior analyst who'd once told me he learned more from me in a year than from any textbook, avoided my eyes. And then there was Callista, seated near Marissa, her lips painted that same red that had become her trademark. She twirled a stylus in her fingers like a dagger, her eyes dancing with anticipation. I could almost hear her thoughts. Let's see if the old man can keep up. Marissa gestured for me to begin. I stood, adjusted my tie, a reflex of professionalism, and started presenting. Our phased approach to Ishikawa Holdings involves 3 key pillars. I began, clicking to the first slide. First, ensuring linguistic integrity that respects honorifics and idiomatic expressions. Second, adapting marketing collateral to reflect not just language but cultural nuance. And third, maintaining consistent quality control to protect our brand and theirs. As I spoke, I felt the old rhythm return. My voice was steady, my hands confident as they emphasized key points. This was my element, bridging worlds, connecting people, making sure words weren't just translated but transformed into meaning. I could almost forget the undercurrent of betrayal coursing beneath the surface, the way Marissa's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I was halfway through explaining the new quality assurance protocols when it happened. Marissa's hand shot up, her perfectly manicured fingers slicing the air. The room fell silent. "Julian," she said, her voice a mixture of cold steel and forced politeness. "We appreciate your passion for this project, truly. But—" She paused, glancing around the table as if collecting a jury's approval. "But this isn't personal. It's just business." I felt the words like a gut punch. I stood frozen, my pointer hovering over the bullet point that had taken me 3 nights to perfect. "I'm sorry," I said, the question more rhetorical than anything. She shifted in her chair, crossing her legs, and leaned forward as if confiding something of great importance. "We're moving to a more scalable, AI-integrated model for translation services," she announced. Her voice was measured, each word precise, like a lawyer delivering a closing argument. "Our research indicates that machine learning algorithms can handle the bulk of the translation workload faster and more cost-effectively than any human. Even Google Translate can do this. Even Google Translate." The phrase echoed in my mind, bouncing off the inside of my skull like a cruel joke. I thought about the Ishikawa executives, the ones who had written me letters thanking me for preserving their cultural dignity in every document. I thought about the months I'd spent in Tokyo, learning the subtleties of their business etiquette so that we wouldn't offend them with a careless word. "Marissa," I said, my voice steady despite the hurricane in my chest, "I don't think you understand what's at stake." Ishikawa expects. She cut me off with a dismissive wave. "Julian," she said, her tone cool and final, "this isn't a debate. It's a decision." She turned her attention to the rest of the table. "Effective immediately, we'll be dissolving the Global Language Services Division. Callista's team will oversee the integration of AI tools to handle all translation work moving forward." Callista's lips curved into a satisfied smirk. She looked at me like a cat who'd cornered a mouse, her eyes gleaming with triumph. I fought the urge to roll up my presentation and throw it across the table. Instead, I breathed deeply, steadying the rage that threatened to erupt. I turned to Marissa, the woman who had once asked me to translate her grandmother's old letters so she could read them on her wedding day. The woman who had told me she admired my empathy, my ability to make people feel heard across language barriers. I searched her eyes for a glimmer of that woman, but all I saw was the CEO, the strategist, the cold operator who saw me as a line item on a spreadsheet. "I see," I said finally, my voice calm but laced with the fury I'd swallowed all week. I gathered my papers slowly, methodically, giving myself time to collect the shards of my dignity. "I wish you luck at your next meeting." A hush fell over the room. I let the words settle like dust on a polished table. Some of the leadership team shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between me and Marissa. Gregory Cho looked like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Callista didn't even bother hiding her smirk. Marissa just blinked, as if surprised that I hadn't fought harder, hadn't begged for mercy, or launched into a fiery defense of my department. But I knew the battle was already lost. The real war would come later, in boardrooms where the AI tools stumbled and the clients demanded answers, in contracts where a single mistranslated clause would cost millions. I tucked my notes into my briefcase, slid my laptop closed, and stood. The room felt cold now, sterile, as if all the warmth had been sucked out with a single breath. As I turned toward the door, I paused for just a moment and looked back at Marissa. Even Google Translate. I repeated the words like a bitter echo. Good luck with that. Then I walked out, my footsteps deliberate, echoing down the corridor like a drumbeat of defiance. I didn't look back. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. That weekend was a void, an empty, aching space where the steady rhythm of work calls, emails, and late-night revisions used to hum in the background of my life. Without them, the silence was deafening. I woke up on Saturday morning half expecting an urgent email from Ishikawa Holdings, something about a mistranslation in the quarterly report or a polite but insistent request for a last-minute cultural consult. But there was nothing. Just the usual notifications from a news app I'd forgotten to delete, the occasional LinkedIn update from a colleague I'd probably never see again, and a single promotional email from some furniture outlet I didn't even remember subscribing to. I lay there in bed staring at the ceiling, the light gray and flat like my mood, wondering how my entire professional existence could be so easily erased. The quiet settled into the walls of our apartment, filling the corners like a fog I couldn't chase away. I made coffee and drank it alone at the kitchen island. Marissa's mug, white with a chipped rim she always claimed gave it character, sat untouched on the other side, a relic of a relationship that had once felt as steady as the sunrise. I wondered if she was at the office, rolling out her AI-integrated strategy with Callista smirking at her side, or maybe she was in some investor meeting, explaining how automation was going to revolutionize the way Orion Systems did business. Either way, I didn't expect a call. She'd made that perfectly clear. This isn't personal, Julian. It's just business. I thought about the clients I'd personally flown across the world to meet. The ones who'd met me at airport terminals with cautious smiles, who'd handed me business cards with both hands because that's how you show respect in Tokyo. The ones who'd sent handwritten notes in thick, looping Japanese characters, thanking me for making them feel heard. I remembered Mr. Ishikawa himself, bowing low after a presentation and telling me in heavily accented English, "Julian-san, you are the reason we trust your company." I could still see his face in my mind. The deep lines of experience, the slight hesitation before speaking as if weighing every word. That was trust, something no machine could ever replicate. But now I was just a line item trimmed by a woman who once said she loved my attention to detail. I wondered if Marissa even remembered the hours I'd spent explaining to her why a certain phrase in Japanese marketing materials could make or break a campaign. I'd watch her eyes light up as she saw the possibilities, the connections forged through careful language. Now, those moments felt like echoes from another life. I sat at the window, watching the city outside blur in a haze of steel and glass. The streets were quieter on weekends, but even in the stillness, the world felt like it was moving too fast for me to catch up. I tried to distract myself, turning on the TV and flipping through channels, but every news segment felt like a reminder of how irrelevant I'd become. AI breakthroughs, record-breaking stock prices, new corporate mergers, all spoken in the same clipped voices that might as well have been generated by a machine. I turned it off and let the silence return. By Sunday, the quiet had seeped into my bones. I went for a walk just to escape the apartment, but every street corner felt like it had been painted over with a fresh coat of Marissa's new world. Billboards boasted about digital transformation and AI integration. Cafes had signs offering chatbots for ordering. Even the corner bookstore was advertising an app that translated books on demand. I paused at the window, staring at a stack of Japanese novels that I knew would never be read the way they deserved. Through the careful, respectful eyes of a human translator who understood the weight of every word. I thought about the time I'd stayed up all night rewriting a single clause in a contract because I knew it would make the difference between closing a deal and offending a client. That was gone now, replaced by a line of code. I walked aimlessly until I found myself near the Orion Systems headquarters, the building where my entire career had unfolded, where I'd fought to prove that language was more than data points. The glass facade reflected the sky back at me, a perfect, impersonal shield. I could almost see Marissa at her desk, focused and efficient, never missing a beat. I wondered if she'd even pause to think about what Monday would bring. Because Monday, Ishikawa Holdings had a live negotiation scheduled. A meeting that I'd been preparing for weeks, with cultural protocols and carefully rehearsed phrases that took months of relationship building. Without me, they'd be flying blind. A flicker of satisfaction warmed me, a small, defiant ember in the cold of that weekend. Marissa had no idea what she'd just done. I thought about the clients who'd refused to speak unless I was in the room. I thought about the contracts that could unravel with one misplaced honorific or the wrong idiom. The silent power I'd wielded, the bridge I'd built between languages and cultures, it couldn't be replaced by a chatbot or an algorithm, no matter how fancy. I knew that. And on Monday, Marissa would know it too. Back at home, I sat down with a notepad, letting the ink soak into the paper as I wrote a single line. They don't speak to machines. They speak to people. It was something Mr. Ishikawa had said to me once, his voice firm with the dignity of a man who knew his culture was not a market trend but a heritage. I stared at that line, repeating it in my mind like a mantra. I'd spent years making sure that every translation wasn't just accurate but carried the respect those words deserved. I was the voice they trusted, and that wasn't something Marissa or Callista could understand, no matter how many slides they presented or algorithms they installed. The weekend silence continued. No work emails. No urgent calls. Just me, my thoughts, and the weight of everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. I knew that come Monday, the storm I'd been bracing for would hit. Ishikawa Holdings would expect me. And when they didn't see me, when they saw Callista fumbling through her slides and trying to explain away the cultural missteps, they'd remember who had always been there, who had always made sure their voice was heard. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair, the silence of the apartment wrapping around me like a cocoon. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew one thing. I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. And if Marissa thought she could erase me from the story, she was about to learn that language, real language, wasn't something you could automate away. It was trust. It was connection. It was human. And she'd just fired the one person who understood that better than anyone. At exactly 9:06 a.m. My phone buzzed, rattling the cup of cold coffee beside it. I'd been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, going over every line of Ishikawa Holdings' negotiation strategy in my head. It was supposed to be the culmination of weeks of preparation, a careful dance of language and cultural nuance, the kind of high-stakes meeting I lived for. Only now, I wasn't in that boardroom. I was sitting on my couch, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, staring at the same ceiling I'd memorized over the weekend. The first message came from Tarek, the junior analyst who'd always looked to me for guidance when Japanese phrases tangled his tongue. "They're panicking," the message read. My stomach tightened, a strange mixture of satisfaction and dread. I didn't reply. I let him sweat a little. At 9:21, another ping lit up the screen. Callista tried to open the meeting. Ishikawa's lead just said, "Where is Mr. Crane?" I smirked, imagining the way Mr. Ishikawa would have delivered that line. Calm, polite, but with an edge of steel that cut deeper than any raised voice. I could picture Callista's bright red lipstick faltering, her words drying up as she realized that her AI tools couldn't salvage her credibility. I sipped the coffee, bitter and cold, but satisfying in a way that reminded me I was still in control, even if Marissa didn't know it yet. At 9:34, Tarek's third message arrived. They tried using translate tools live. It failed. The delegation is stone-faced. The meeting is paused. I could almost hear the hush that must have settled over the boardroom, the awkward shuffle of chairs, the embarrassed coughs as Callista fumbled with her tablet, her algorithms failing her in real time. I imagined Marissa's face, confident, then confused, then furious. But it was the final message that gave me the greatest satisfaction. Mr. Ishikawa refused to sign anything. He told Marissa in perfect English, "We do not speak with machines. We speak with people." I leaned back in my chair, a grin stretching across my face. That was the line I'd taught him months ago, during a dinner in Shinjuku over sushi and sake, when he'd confessed his fear that Western companies saw his language as an obstacle instead of a bridge. I had told him then that I believed in people, not just words. And now, his words, my words, were being thrown like a spear right back at Marissa and her team of AI evangelists. I pictured her face, that perfect mask of composure cracking around the edges. I imagined the way she'd probably blamed Callista first, then Tarek, then anyone but herself. She'd never been good at admitting she was wrong, not even when we were just husband and wife instead of CEO and expendable department head. It was always easier for her to move the pieces on the board than to see the whole game. But she'd underestimated one thing. Trust wasn't something you could automate. I let the grin fade as I set the phone down. I thought about Ishikawa Holdings, how they'd insisted on small details, the correct bow at the start of the meeting, the proper honorifics, the subtle phrasing that showed respect. I taught every executive on my team how to navigate those waters, because I knew that one wrong word could derail years of relationship building. And now, with me gone, they were flailing, drowning in their own hubris. Part of me wanted to swoop in and save them, to pick up the phone and dial in, to translate the chaos back into harmony. But I stayed where I was, letting the silence fill the apartment. I needed them to see what they had lost. I needed Marissa to understand that her decision to cut me wasn't just a budget line. It was a breach of trust, a fracture that no software patch could fix. I stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. The skyline glistened in the morning sun, glass towers reflecting the world back at itself like a hall of mirrors. Somewhere in one of those towers, Marissa was probably pacing, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor as she tried to salvage the meeting. I imagined Callista beside her, offering digital solutions that would only make things worse. I imagined Tarek, torn between loyalty to me and fear of Marissa's wrath. They'd called me obsolete. Even Google Translate can do this, she'd said. I wondered if she still believed that now. I turned back to my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen. Tarek's messages glowed like small fires in the dark. I thought about responding, offering a quick tip or a simple solution that might help them stumble through. But I didn't. They needed to see this through, to understand that I wasn't just a translator. I was the reason the room didn't fall apart, the reason the trust held. I was the bridge they had burned, and now they were stuck on the wrong side of the river. At 10:02 a.m., my phone buzzed again, this time with an unknown number. I let it ring twice before answering. Julian Crane, I said, my voice steady, calm, but every nerve on high alert. It was Gregory Cho, his voice strained and tight. Julian. I know this is awkward, but we're in a bit of a bind. The Ishikawa team won't speak with anyone else. They asked for you by name. I paused, letting the silence stretch, feeling the weight of his desperation. I'm unavailable, I said finally, each word slow and deliberate. But you're welcome to try Google Translate again. He let out a shaky breath, probably rehearsing some apology in his head. Julian, please. What would it take to get you back? We can discuss terms. I cut him off. Gregory, I appreciate the call, but I'm done. There was a long pause, a hesitation that spoke volumes. Julian, they trust you, he said, his voice almost pleading. We can't close this without you. A part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, but another part reveled in the vindication. They'd bet on machines, and now the machines had failed them. I ended the call without another word, setting the phone down on the counter. The sun had shifted by then, slanting through the window and warming the tiles under my feet. I leaned against the counter and let the heat sink into me, a small comfort in a weekend of cold realizations. I could see now that everything was shifting, that the empire Marissa had built on the promise of technology and automation was cracking under the weight of its own arrogance. And I was the crack they hadn't seen coming. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the calm settle in. They'd underestimated me, but more importantly, they'd underestimated the human element, the voice, the handshake, the respect that no machine could replicate. And now they were learning the hard way. I picked up my phone again, scrolling through the messages, watching the desperation build in the unread notifications. I didn't answer. Not yet, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all, and let them come to you, on their knees, ready to admit they'd made a mistake. And when that moment came, I'd be ready. Not as their translator, not as their pawn, but as the man who never needed a machine to know his own worth. Tuesday morning arrived like a cold slap. The sun barely peeked through the blinds when I got the panicked email. A legal assistant from Orion, whom I barely remembered except for her nervous laughter in the hallways, had forwarded me the latest contract draft from Ishikawa Holdings with the subject line, "Urgent, please read." I clicked it open, half expecting another reminder of my redundancy. Instead, I found a disaster that would make any seasoned translator's skin crawl. The file was supposed to be the finalized version of the partnership agreement, one I'd personally nurtured and translated through months of careful negotiation. Every clause had been debated, every word placed with surgical precision to avoid any cultural missteps that might offend our Japanese partners. I'd poured myself into that work, knowing that trust in language was more than a courtesy, it was currency. Now, staring at the screen, my stomach dropped. The contract had been run through an AI translation tool, likely some off-the-shelf product Callista had championed. The results were catastrophic. 3 key clauses were flipped upside down. What had originally stated that Ishikawa Holdings would pay a 3% performance bonus to Orion Systems for exceeding quarterly targets now read, Orion Systems agrees to pay Ishikawa Holdings a 3% performance bonus. Retroactively, I could practically hear Mr. Ishikawa's voice in my head, measured and polite, but carrying that razor's edge of disappointment. Mr. Crane, this is unacceptable. It got worse. A clause that had once defined shared development of intellectual property had been twisted into Orion Systems grants unilateral control of all development to Ishikawa Holdings. I felt bile rise in my throat as I read it, my eyes scanning for any sign that someone had caught this mistake before it was sent. But no, there it was, in black and white, with a signature line and an AI-generated footnote. This document was automatically translated for efficiency. Efficiency. My jaw clenched. 1,000 memories flooded back. The dinners in Tokyo where I'd explained every detail of that clause to the Ishikawa team, reassuring them that our partnership was exactly that, a partnership, not a surrender. The hours I'd spent ensuring every phrase carried the weight of mutual respect. And now, with a single click, the very essence of that relationship had been obliterated. I sipped my coffee, but it was cold and bitter on my tongue. I set it aside and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, letting the reality sink in. Without me, Orion had walked straight into a minefield. AI might be able to process words, but it didn't know how to navigate the labyrinth of Japanese business etiquette, the subtle honorifics, the implied humility, the unspoken boundaries that couldn't be programmed into a machine. And now, thanks to Callista and her digital revolution, Orion Systems had effectively offered Ishikawa Holdings everything they'd been so careful to protect. I opened the next email from the same assistant. She sounded desperate. Julian, I know you're no longer with the company, but I don't know who else to call. The contract was sent to Ishikawa's team yesterday. Their lawyers flagged the reversals. Marissa is in a panic. Please help. I didn't laugh. Not even a bitter, triumphant chuckle. I just sat there, staring at the screen, the weight of years of trust now at the mercy of a machine that couldn't tell a courtesy from a command. I pictured Marissa, probably in that same boardroom where she'd fired me, her face a mask of composed horror as Mr. Ishikawa's team dissected every line of that contract. I imagined her blaming Callista, the AI vendors, maybe even me, because accountability had never been her strength. But I didn't move. I didn't reply. I thought about all the times I'd stood in that same boardroom, explaining that translation wasn't just about converting words from one language to another. It was about understanding intention, context, respect. About recognizing that in Japan, a single word could change the tone of an entire meeting. About knowing that trust was earned in the spaces between the lines. I wondered if Marissa remembered those lessons now, or if she was too busy scrambling to find a scapegoat. My phone buzzed again, Tarek this time. Julian, please, can you help? It's chaos. They're threatening to pull the deal. I turned the phone over in my hand, my reflection staring back at me from the black screen. This was the storm I'd predicted, the one that was always waiting at the edges of arrogance and short-sightedness. And now it had arrived, wearing the digital fingerprints of the AI Marissa had chosen over me. Outside, the city bustled as if nothing had changed. But for me, the world had shifted. I could feel the tremor of the fault line I'd left behind, a crack running straight through Orion Systems' carefully curated image. I had warned them. I had told them that language wasn't just words, that respect couldn't be automated, that trust was more than a line on a balance sheet. But they'd refused to listen. I stood and stepped out onto the balcony, the wind biting at my face. From here, I could see the skyline, the steel and glass towers of companies that lived and died by contracts like the one now threatening to bring Orion to its knees. I let the wind carry away the last of my frustration. I didn't need to be in that boardroom to know I was right. The catastrophe unfolding inside those polished walls wasn't just a business blunder. It was the price of forgetting what it meant to be human. I watched a delivery truck navigate the crowded street below, a tiny reminder that despite all the talk of automation and AI, some things still needed a human touch. Just like that contract. just like every relationship I'd spent my career building. I thought of Mr. Ishikawa again, his measured tone, his respectful bow. I knew he wouldn't stand for the insult embedded in that AI-driven disaster. And he'd be right not to. I turned back to the apartment, picking up the phone and scrolling through the messages once more. Tarek's desperation, the assistant's panic, the echoes of a company crumbling under its own arrogance. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. They'd made their choice. Now they'd live with it. I closed the balcony door and sat down at my desk, a calm settling over me like a well-worn coat. I didn't know exactly what the next chapter would look like, but I knew one thing for certain. Marissa and her team would learn the hard way that language couldn't be tamed by algorithms alone. It needed heart and trust and the patience to understand that sometimes the smallest word could hold the biggest meaning. And in that silence, I found my peace. I wasn't just a translator. I was the bridge they'd burned, and now they'd have to build it themselves. Wednesday afternoon, the city hummed outside my apartment window, but inside, the only sound was the low buzz of my phone vibrating on the countertop. I let it ring twice, maybe 3 times, before I picked it up and saw the name flashing across the screen, Gregory Cho, General Counsel at Orion Systems. The same man who'd sat across from me in countless late-night contract review sessions, the same man who'd once confided that he trusted my translations more than any software, no matter how sophisticated. I answered, letting the silence hang between us for a moment longer than necessary. "Julian," he said, his voice thin and weary, like someone who'd spent the entire night wrestling with the kind of legal mess that only a catastrophic mistranslation could cause. "Julian, I know this is awkward, but we may need you back in the room. The Ishikawa team won't speak with anyone else. They asked for you by name." I almost smiled. The vindication was sharp and cold in my chest, like the first sip of a drink you know you shouldn't enjoy. "Ishikawa Holdings asked for me." I repeated, each word carefully measured. I pictured Marissa in that glass conference room, her expression a cocktail of panic and pride. I wondered if she'd even slept since Monday, or if the fallout had kept her pacing, haunted by the realization that she'd cut the one person who could have saved her from this mess. Gregory sighed, the weight of the world evident in that single exhale. "Yes," they said, and I quote, "We do not wish to continue negotiations without Mr. Crane present. They're refusing to sign anything. They won't even discuss revisions." I could hear papers rustling on his end, the frantic shuffle of a man desperate to fix something too big for his own hands. "Julian, I know this is a lot to ask, but," I cut him off gently. "Gregory, let me ask you something. When Marissa decided to replace me with AI, was this possibility even considered? Did anyone think that maybe, just maybe, I was doing more than just translating words?" The question wasn't rhetorical. I wanted him to say it, to admit that he'd watched my department get dismantled and hadn't lifted a finger. He hesitated. "Julian, it wasn't my decision," he said finally, his voice small. "You know that." I argued against it, but he trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. We both knew where the buck had stopped. Silence filled the line. I let it stretch, enjoying the power it gave me now. They'd all thought I was disposable, a relic of a bygone era where human nuance mattered. Now they were learning the hard way that the most advanced algorithm couldn't decode respect, trust, or the subtle currents of cross-cultural business. "Gregory," I said at last, my tone calm but with an edge I couldn't hide. "I'm unavailable, but you're welcome to try Google Translate again." I let that sink in, picturing his face crumpling as the words hit home. He'd have to report that to Marissa, to the board, to everyone who'd signed off on the decision to automate me out of existence. "Julian," he started, desperation creeping into his voice. I cut him off again. "I'm done, Gregory. They made their choice. Now they can live with it." I ended the call before he could respond, dropping the phone onto the table with a satisfying thud. I stared at it for a moment, my own reflection staring back in the black glass. I felt no guilt, no sympathy, just a clean, resolute calm. They'd come to me too late. I was done being their safety net. The afternoon light spilled across the apartment, turning the hardwood floor to gold. I walked over to the window and looked out over the city. The towers of glass and steel seemed to shimmer with possibility, the traffic below a river of movement I no longer felt a part of. I'd given Orion Systems everything, my nights, my weekends, my heart. I'd flown across oceans to secure deals, stayed up all night rewriting contracts to protect them from lawsuits, and taught my team to treat every language as a living, breathing thing. And in the end, Marissa had thrown all that away for a machine. I thought of Ishikawa Holdings, of Mr. Ishikawa's quiet dignity, of his trust in me to get every word right. I could see his face as he read the AI-mangled contract, the polite mask slipping as confusion gave way to offense. I imagined him setting down his pen and telling Marissa, in perfect English, "We do not wish to speak with machines. We wish to speak with people." The pride in that moment was mine, and I clung to it like a lifeline. I wandered back to the kitchen, the remnants of breakfast still on the counter. The coffee had gone cold again. I poured it down the sink, watching the dark liquid swirl and disappear. I wondered if Marissa was in her office now, replaying every decision she'd made, questioning every moment she'd let Callista's red lipstick and quick promises drown out the warnings I'd given her. Maybe she was finally realizing that translation wasn't just a line item, it was a lifeline. The phone buzzed again, another message from Tarek. "Julian, please. They're falling apart. Investors are asking questions. The board is panicking." I could almost hear the tremor in his hands as he typed, the fear of a young analyst caught in the middle of a war he never signed up for. For a moment, I felt a twinge of empathy. Tarek had always respected me, always stayed late to learn, always asked the right questions. But loyalty had its limits, and I was done paying for other people's mistakes. I closed the message without replying. I walked to my bookshelf, running my fingers over the spines of books I'd collected over a lifetime of loving language, French poetry, Japanese business etiquette guides, collections of proverbs from a dozen countries. I thought of the meetings, the dinners, the small gifts from grateful clients. A signed copy of a Chilean author's memoir. A silk tie from a Japanese partner. A letter from Mr. Ishikawa, thanking me for making him feel heard. These were the trophies that mattered. Not the glass awards Marissa had chased for the company's lobby. As I sat down at my desk, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was free. Orion's collapse wasn't my burden to bear. Let Marissa navigate the damage report, the board's questions, the investor calls. Let her explain how a company that once prided itself on trust and cultural understanding had failed so spectacularly to understand the one culture that mattered most, the human one. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of 1,000 late nights and 1,000 small victories lifting off my shoulders. They'd asked what it would take to get me back. They'd asked me to fix what they'd broken. But they'd made their decision the moment Marissa looked me in the eye and said, "Even Google Translate can do this." They'd chosen speed over soul, and now they were paying the price. The damage report was in, and the damage was permanent. Friday morning dawned heavy with gray clouds, like the world itself was holding its breath. I pulled my coat tighter as I walked up the steps to Orion Systems headquarters, each step echoing in the empty air. They'd begged me to come in. Gregory's voice had cracked on the phone, promising respect, offering apologies. I'd agreed, not for them, but for me. I wanted to see the fallout with my own eyes, to stand in the room where they'd erased me and watch them struggle to rebuild what they destroyed. The boardroom was packed. Executives and legal advisors sat stiff in their chairs, eyes darting around the table like children caught in a lie. Callista was there too, her red lipstick smudged and her confidence in tatters. She looked at me like I was a ghost. Marissa stood at the head of the table, her posture perfect, but her eyes hollow. "Julian," she started, her voice cracking on my name. "We owe you an apology." Her gaze flicked to Callista, who looked like she'd aged 10 years in a week. "We thought speed and software were enough," Callista said, her voice small. "I was wrong. I dismissed your work. I dismissed you. I didn't understand what you actually did for this company." I let the silence stretch, enjoying the discomfort. Then I nodded, my expression calm but resolute. "Thank you," I said, "but I'm not returning." A hush fell over the room like a funeral shroud. Marissa's eyes widened, her mouth opening and closing as if she'd forgotten how to speak. "I've accepted an offer," I continued, "with Ishikawa Holdings. I'll be leading their North American strategy team." The stunned silence deepened, broken only by the shuffling of papers and the whisper of disbelief. Marissa's lips trembled. She looked like she wanted to protest, but the words never came. She knew. She'd lost me, and no apology could fix that. I stood, gathering my things with deliberate calm. "Good luck," I said, meeting her eyes one last time. And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving them to their apology and their mess. My new office was quiet in a way that felt earned, not empty. The walls were a pale cream, the furniture simple but elegant, Japanese design at its most refined. A bonsai tree sat in the corner, its branches carefully sculpted, a symbol of patience and respect. It felt like a space built for thought, not for show. From the window, I could see the Tokyo skyline, stretching out in all directions, a sea of possibilities. It was a far cry from the glass and steel fortress that was Orion Systems. Here, there were no echoes of betrayal, just the promise of new beginnings. Ishikawa Holdings had welcomed me like a trusted ally, not a tool to be replaced. From the moment I walked in, I was treated as the bridge between worlds, the human connection they'd always known they needed but had feared losing to the tide of technology. I didn't have to prove that language was more than grammar. They already believed it. Every contract I reviewed, every presentation I prepared, was met with respect and a willingness to listen. No one asked me to justify my existence with a cost analysis or a graph showing AI efficiency. They knew the cost of losing a voice that could navigate cultural nuance. My team here was small, but each member was chosen for their understanding that language is about intention, about human connection. We weren't a department of word processors. We were ambassadors of meaning. I hired carefully. A Korean-American interpreter who lived in Seoul for a decade, a Brazilian linguist who'd spent half her life in Tokyo, a Nigerian consultant who could read between the lines in any conversation. We didn't optimize, we humanized. We didn't translate, we connected. Every morning, I walked through the door with a sense of purpose I'd thought I'd lost forever. I'd left behind the corporate politicking, the boardroom betrayals, the cold stares that always came with being the man who reminded everyone that people mattered. Orion Systems had traded all that away for speed, and now they were paying the price. Reports reached me from old contacts still inside Orion. Callista had resigned, unable to salvage the AI-driven chaos she'd unleashed. Investors were pulling back, wary of a company that had forgotten the value of trust. Marissa was facing the board more often than her own reflection, her confidence crumbling under the scrutiny of people who'd once cheered her digital revolution. They'd built a future without a voice, and now no one was listening. In moments of reflection, I felt a pang of regret for the time I'd spent there, for the relationships I'd tried to build. But then I remembered the day Marissa looked me in the eye and told me that even Google Translate could do my job. That was the day I stopped mourning the loss and started building something better. Ishikawa Holdings didn't just want my skills. They wanted my heart, my experience, my belief that language was a living, breathing thing. And here, in this quiet office, I was more than a translator. I was the voice they'd never understood until they'd lost it. Sometimes I thought about Marissa, about the hollow echo of her voice when I told her I was gone. I wondered if she ever understood the cost of losing me. But then I'd look around this space, this sanctuary of respect and purpose, and I knew the answer. Some lessons can't be learned in a boardroom. Some lessons need to be lived. And at Orion, they were living that lesson now. Every time an AI program stumbled and a client walked away, they'd chosen a future without a voice. I had chosen to be the voice that mattered. Marissa texted me once more, the words as cold as a winter gust. I didn't know what we were losing. I stared at the screen, the glow of her message flickering like a dying candle. The irony stung. She hadn't known what she was losing, and now it was too late. I didn't reply. Some things can't be translated after the damage is done. I stood by the window of my new Tokyo office, the city alive with possibility below me. Ishikawa Holdings had given me more than a job. They'd given me a chance to be the bridge I'd always wanted to be, the one who didn't just convert words, but who connected cultures. I wasn't just a translator anymore. I was the voice that ensured every handshake carried trust, every contract carried respect, every meeting carried meaning. I'd watched Orion Systems unravel from a distance, their once mighty brand crumbling under the weight of automation that couldn't grasp the human element. Callista's resignation had been the first crack. Investors had fled, and Marissa had been left alone to manage the damage she'd unleashed. And while they scrambled, I thrived. Standing there, the sun rising over Tokyo, I felt a profound peace. The world needed more than machines, it needed people. It needed voices that could bridge divides, that could carry intent and empathy. And that was something no algorithm could ever replicate. I turned off my phone and slipped it into my pocket. I had work to do, real work that mattered. Language wasn't just words. It was the bond that kept us human. And in that bond, I'd found my place.